news tonight. This Monday, half the country is wet. In several states, there has been a foot of rain. Why is there suddenly so much water where very recently the subject has been drought? We'll take a closer look. The first American president in Cuba since Fidel Castro took over. Jimmy Carter says there is no evidence of a Cuban connection to biological weapons. The company that poisoned the village ends up buying the village, only to shut it down. And where the men have no power, the women control everything. To visit your wife, you go to her mother's house.
From ABC News World Headquarters in New York, this is World News Tonight with Peter Jennings.
Good evening, everyone. We're going to begin with the weather tonight, which is usually only the case when it is bad, and it is. Across a wide swath of the country today, there has been a series of damaging thunderstorms from Texas to Minnesota and across to New England. Rivers are suddenly at flood stage, and many, many thousands of lives have been disrupted. Our first report is from ABC's Dean Reynolds.
The worst of it left the middle of the nation soaking wet and bracing for floods. Today, the Mississippi River looked particularly treacherous.
The river has, such power, and when you see it this high, it really kind of takes your breath away.
Rain pummeled Nashville this morning, the same deluge that soaked the upper Midwest this weekend, with up to a foot of water in places.
Now, every progressive storm system, because the ground is saturated, has the potential to bring flooding to the region.
In Missouri, water is creeping up the bank near the Gateway Arch in St. Louis. Golf courses are submerged, along with neighborhood streets and backyards.
No! Go to high ground! You can't make it that way. You'll get washed away.
A thick layer of stormy weather runs from Kansas all the way to New England now. The storm has killed at least 3 people, including a teenage rafter who drowned in Ohio's Chagrin River.
I warned them over and over again, and they don't listen.
The storm is moving quickly and forcefully. High winds uprooted trees in Pennsylvania and did the same thing in Maryland. A semi-trailer was blown over in Minnesota on Saturday, and now they're talking about 80-mile-an-hour winds tonight in the Carolinas. This afternoon, tornado watches are up along the Atlantic shore from New Jersey to Virginia. And this afternoon, the rain started falling in New York.
And there's more, because another potentially volatile storm system is now taking shape and is due to hit the waterlogged Midwest by Thursday, and then head east. Dean Reynolds, ABC News, Chicago.
A little later in the broadcast, we'll take a closer look at the causes behind these heavy rains and the persisting drought. First, we're going to go to Washington. President Bush signed the $190 billion farm bill today, which is filled with subsidies for farmers. It has support from many politicians in the South and the Midwest, where the next congressional election looms large. Other politicians think the bill is bloated with unnecessary spending. ABC's Terry Moran is at the White House. Some of the neutral analysts, Terry, think the same thing.
They do, Peter. This farm bill pitted President Bush's free market rhetoric against the political reality of an election year. Reality won.
In an early morning ceremony, Mr. Bush seemed almost sheepish about signing the bill.
It's not a perfect bill, I know that. But no bill ever is.
The bill will increase government subsidies to farmers by a staggering 80%, which analysts say will lead to overproduction, too much food flooding world markets and pushing down prices. That's made Europeans and others furious at Mr. Bush. They say the huge new subsidies for U.S. farmers are unfair and violate the same international fair trading laws the president has frequently demanded they abide by. It's the latest evidence, they say, of the president's willingness to sell out his free trade principles for political gain. Last month, to protect American steel workers, Mr. Bush slapped tariffs of up to 30% on imported steel. 2 weeks later, the administration imposed punitive tariffs on Canadian lumber. All this, critics charge, renders Mr. Bush a hypocrite on free trade.
It's very difficult for us to go around telling other countries now that they should reduce their trade barriers, they should reduce their subsidies, when we don't practice what we preach.
The White House says that the president is still committed to free trade, but Peter, in an election year when control of Congress is up for grabs and every key constituency comes to Washington with a wish list, that commitment is seeming very hard for the president to keep.
Many thanks, Terry. Terry Moran at the White House. Former President Carter made news in Cuba today. Mr. Carter is the first president to go to the island since the Cuban Revolution led by Fidel Castro more than 40 years ago now. And after all these years, Cuba is still a sensitive subject for some Americans. Just before Mr. Carter got there, one of President Bush's political appointees to the State Department said that the Cuban government was involved in producing biological agents. ABC's George Stephanopoulos reports from Havana tonight, where Mr. Carter was bound to make news.
Peter, I don't think Fidel Castro could have asked for a better start to this trip. President Carter surprised people here by publicly backing the Cuban government in its rhetorical battle with the Bush administration over biological weapons. After touring Cuba's top biotechnology lab, Carter took up the charge of bioterrorism, saying that his sources in the State Department and White House supported Castro's defense.
I asked them specifically, on more than one occasion, is there any evidence that Cuba has been involved in sharing any information to any other country on earth that could be used for terrorist purposes? And the answer from our experts on intelligence was no.
From Newfoundland, the Secretary of State responded.
I don't know what briefings the President Carter may have received. I'm sure we made ourselves available to him. As Undersecretary Bolton said recently, we do believe that Cuba has a biological offensive research capability.
The State Department added that releasing the evidence was out of the question because it would jeopardize sources in the intelligence community. Less comforting to Castro was Carter's first meeting of the day. It was with leaders of a movement called the Varela Project, which has collected more than 11,000 signatures for a national referendum on political and economic reform. The activists were encouraged by Carter's interest, but said they didn't ask, and Carter didn't offer to press their cause with Castro. The former president said nothing today about this meeting, but movement leaders are hoping he'll single them out for praise when he gives a nationally televised address to the Cuban people tomorrow night. They believe this will both advance their cause and give them some protection after Carter leaves. Peter?
Thank you, George. George Stephanopoulos in Havana today. One other thing, after more than 40 years, the latest ABC News poll finds that Americans are still divided about U.S. policy on Cuba. 47% are in favor of establishing diplomatic relations. 45% are opposed. 44% believe the trade embargo against Cuba should end, and 48% do not. Well, in the Middle East today, it was not the best of the beginning of a week for the Israeli or the Palestinian leader. Yesterday, the Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon was turned on by his own conservative Likud party, which voted against him and rejected any idea of establishing a Palestinian state. The Palestinian president, Yasser Arafat, left the West Bank town of Ramallah today for the first time in 6 months, and he discovered that not everyone was happy to see him. ABC's Dan Harris reports from Jenin.
For his trip today, Yasser Arafat used helicopters borrowed from Jordan. The Israelis have destroyed all of his. The first stop, Bethlehem, where he toured the Church of the Nativity. He called the 39-day standoff here a real tragedy.
This cannot be accepted at all internationally.
After Bethlehem, Arafat came here to Jenin, scene of some of the most deadly and devastating fighting of the Israeli military campaign. Thousands came to a refugee camp partially leveled by Israeli bulldozers to hear Arafat speak. They waited for over an hour, but Arafat never showed up. His aides said there wasn't enough security. Privately, they said they were worried he would be heckled by supporters of militant Islamic groups. As his helicopters flew away, some cheered for him. People here understand. They're not angry.
No, not angry.
Others were angry.
Why didn't he walk on the streets of the camp? Why?
This disagreement was the apparent cause of a gunfight between Arafat's supporters and detractors. The man on the left was shot in the leg. While Arafat's popularity did grow while under siege in Ramallah, many Palestinians are complaining about corruption in his regime and the deals he recently cut with the Israelis that included the arrest and expulsion of militants. But Arafat is indisputably the most powerful Palestinian leader. Today, he spoke defiantly to those Israelis who say the Palestinians should never gain independence. Whether they want it or not, he said, there will be a Palestinian state. The question is whether Arafat will be in charge when it happens. Dan Harris, ABC News, Jenin.
In the overseas briefing today, relations with the rest of the world, President Bush reversed himself today and announced that he will sign a treaty with Russia to reduce the two countries' nuclear arsenals. The number of warheads will be cut by about 2/3 over the next 10 years. Mr. Bush had initially resisted a formal treaty. U.S. troops raided a compound north of Kandahar in Afghanistan today and killed 5 people they say were Taliban fighters. They captured 32 other men. None of them appear, they say, to be high-ranking Taliban. It is the first time in several weeks that U.S. forces have seen any combat. The British Royal Marines ended their 2-week operation in the eastern part of the country today, and they say they did not find any Al-Qaeda fighters. When we come back this evening, so much rain in a time of drought. The best explanation lies on the other side of the world. We'll take a closer look. In other news tonight, a company that polluted a town makes a very unusual deal with the town. They buy the entire thing and will shut it down. And at the end of the broadcast tonight, a traditional place where the tradition is for women to rule and men to obey. The women think it is a heavenly place.
This is World News Tonight with Peter Jennings. Brought to you by Bayer.
Well, we were certainly curious today to know how half of the country can suffer from torrential rains and a punishing drought at the same time. A quarter of the country is actually in deep drought. In the northeast, the most densely populated region, reservoirs should be completely full by this time of year. They're only 72% full. In March, they were only 66% full, which means all this rain has had some effect, but too little in the wrong places. When we take a closer look, we find the best explanation is a strange one. Here's ABC's Ned Potter.
It's been stormy for 2 weeks along the eastern seaboard.
I've never seen the water this high before.
But 2 weeks do not go very far to undo 4 years of drought. This map shows where the rain has been falling so far this month, and it's in places that need it the least. The Midwest and the Ohio Valley, not the Northeast or the Mountain West, which are driest. Scientists say there are unusual global forces at work, some from as far away as the Indian Ocean. Researchers realize that it's been warming steadily there for 50 years.
It's an area where warming of the water can lead to deep cumulus clouds which warm the atmosphere and can in turn affect the jet streams.
The jet stream, of course, is the path followed by high-level winds, often carrying rainstorms with them. The warming Indian Ocean has forced jet streams around the world to shift.
The jet stream tends to be further north, and the storm tracks are further north, and so there's a bit more weather up in Canada, a bit less in the United States.
Kevin Trenberth of the National Center for Atmospheric Research says there may be other very complex reasons. Remember all the talk in past years of La Nina, that periodic cooling of the Pacific, and of global warming or worldwide climate change? Trenberth says all these things have mixed together.
And it led to most of the storms missing Southern California, the Rockies, and a lot of the United States.
That pattern is gradually shifting again, but hardly enough to end this year's drought. Ned Potter, ABC News, New York.
2 other items in the national briefing tonight. The Supreme Court has upheld a government plan to guarantee competition between local telephone services. The measure is supposed to give consumers a choice between different phone companies so as to reduce the cost of local phone calls. And the giant retail chain Sears, which began as a catalog, is buying Lands' End, the catalog, and the largest seller of clothing over the internet. Price is almost $2 billion. Lands' End clothing is expected to appear in Sears stores this fall. When we come back this evening, selling the village to the power company that polluted it.
It's sad. It's sad. I haven't lived it. You know, after all this time, 64 years, I've made a lot of friends.
In Washington state today, 1,500 people returned to homes and businesses after an ammonia leak caused the town of Arlington to be evacuated. Police believe drug dealers were stealing ammonia to make methamphetamines. In Libby, Montana, the Environmental Protection Agency is going to remove asbestos from 800 homes. It usually says asbestos insulation is best left alone. From Ohio tonight, ABC's Barry Serafin reports on an effort to solve industrial pollution for a whole village.
In many ways, Cheshire, Ohio is a picture postcard of small-town America. Its history stretches back to the Civil War, but its future is measured in months. Village Councilman Ron Hammond and Cheshire's 220 other residents are leaving.
I'm ready to go and move my family on to what I feel is better things for us. I think we've suffered enough.
This is the source of their suffering, a giant coal-fired power plant next door. The plant, operated by American Electric Power, towers over Cheshire. Residents have long complained about pollution, especially a sulfuric haze seen here in home video.
This is what the village of Cheshire residents are experiencing.
We had anything from sore eyes, sore throat, headaches, sores on the lips and the throats.
After a government report confirmed health hazards, the residents of Cheshire went to the power company.
Enough was enough. They didn't want to be our neighbor anymore.
The residents made an unusual proposal, asking the power company to buy their homes. In fact, buy the entire town. The price tag, $20 million. In return for a promise by residents not to file health claims, the company agreed. The power plant plans to create a site here for unloading coal. That means homes will be bulldozed. Cheshire will disappear. That is producing mixed feelings of regret and relief. Some of those just outside of the village who are not part of the proposed buyout are just plain angry. This school is just 600 yards from the plant.
It leaves our schools and 800 of our children and staff holding the bag. It leaves us in harm's way.
Even for those getting out of harm's way, leaving isn't easy.
I come here in 1938.
Many, like 82-year-old Boots Hearn, have deep roots here.
There's been a lot of tears shed, but we know we have to go. But it's a shame. This was such a nice little town.
Once the agreement is signed, residents will have about 6 months to say goodbye to their nice little town. Barry Serafin, ABC News, Cheshire, Ohio.
When we come back this evening, the final item in the broadcast, where women rule and harmony reigns for now. Finally this evening, the matriarchy, which as most of us know means the women rule. The tradition dates back thousands of years in history and in myth. Greek mythology tells us of the Amazon women, a tribe feared for its prowess in battle. There are other societies, far more peaceful, which survive today. ABC's Mark Litke reports tonight from the Chinese province of Yunnan.
In the shadows of the Tibetan range that inspired the mythical tales of Shangri-La along the shores of Lugu Lake, things really start to heat up when the sun goes down. This is the courtship dance of the Mosuo people, when women traditionally choose a male companion for the night, or a year, or a lifetime, and the men have no say in the matter. In almost every way, this is a society where women rule the roost. They run the households, control the money, own the land and property, all to be inherited by sisters and daughters. That's the way it's always been, says 69-year-old Bing Ma. A good tradition, she says, with obvious pride. She is the matriarch of a typical Mosuo clan in which her siblings, sons, daughters, grandchildren all live under her roof all their lives. Then there's the Mosuo style of marriage called TCC, or walking to and fro, where a son works in his mother's fields all day, eats his mother's cooking, then goes to visit his wife at her mother's house, which is also where his children stay, with their mother, never the father. Now, it may sound bizarre to a Western visitor, but anthropologists say that because the men here have no power, control no land, and play subservient sexual roles, they have nothing to fight over, making this one of the most harmonious societies on the planet. The Mosuo have no word for war, no murders, no rapes, not even any jails.
Yet the times, they are a-changin' for the Mosuo people. The rapid pace of modernization throughout China today has brought better roads and communications even to the shores of remote Lake Lugu, triggering an invasion of tourists.
and tourist dollars. Suddenly, farmers are leaving their fields for tour guide jobs. Women earn money dressing up tourists in traditional clothing. And the young are starting to abandon tradition for all things modern. Even more troubling, some male tourists here are perpetuating a myth that the Mosuo custom of walking to and fro means promiscuity or free sex. And that's what many men are coming for. There's now even a Lake Lugu red light district with prostitutes from other parts of China offering their services dressed up as Mosuo women. The older generation is dismayed by all this, wondering for the first time how much longer their unique culture will survive. Today, even their age-old courtship dance has lost its way. It's now become a nightly show in which, for a small fee, the tourists are invited to join in. Mark Litke, ABC News in China's Yunnan province.
That is our report on World News Tonight. For the rest of this week on the broadcast, we're going to go in search of America. Tomorrow evening we'll be in Cleveland, where they are investing $1 billion in rebuilding their schools. They believe it is the key to a city's future. I'm Peter Jennings. Have a good evening and good night.